Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola, managing editor of Shadowproof. Thank you for your patience. Took me a little bit to work out some technical issues on my end, but I am joined by Branko Marcetic, who is a staff writer for Jacobin, and you're also a Kiwi, which will become important because I'm going to ask you about some flack you're getting for something you wrote for that's been published addressing your fellow Kiwis on the matter of the Ukraine crisis. So we're discussing the Russia-Ukraine war, and in particular, I don't have a lot of time to dedicate myself to this, but what I'd like to do is, starting with Branko, have these regular discussions that are intended to defend the space that we need to have conversations about what's going on with the war in Ukraine that are just not happening and aren't going to happen, clearly are not going to happen on the airwaves of CNN or MSNBC or some of these other places. And people are going to express solidarity with Ukrainians as they should, but we also needed to talk about the array of issues that relate to what's happening with all players involved. And so I thank you, Branko, for being willing to join me and have this conversation. I particularly wanted to spend time on the crackdowns or the effort to silence people who are engaged in dissent, who are anti-war voices, or simply have pretty well-developed, nuanced viewpoints about what's going on with the crisis. And so, before we get to that topic, we've had 4 days of the war. We're entering the 5th day, and I think we're technically in the 5th day. And anything particular you want to cover at the top here before we get to some of the issues involving crackdowns on dissent? Because things are moving quickly, and also some things have become very alarming as far as developments go in the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think last time I was with you, I said something along the lines of, an invasion is possible, but I hope that it doesn't get that to that point, because an invasion would be bad news for everyone: Russia, Ukraine, the US, Europe, the world. And I think we're starting to see, very much in a practical sense, what that actually means. Putin is now, posturing, or maybe not, who knows, but he has put his nuclear forces on high alert. Belarus has changed its constitution to allow the placement of nuclear weapons. There are calls for a no-fly zone, which, I want to be very clear. A no-fly zone is one of these euphemisms that was invented. First I heard of it was during Libya. I'm sure it was in use before then. And it's supposed to be kind of a way to sell military intervention without it sounding like military intervention. That's just a no-fly zone. In reality, a no-fly zone means potentially shooting down enemy planes, or at least other countries' planes that are in that zone. That's why it's a no-fly zone. There's calls for, just today, some of the, frankly, just out of control, reckless rhetoric that is being thrown around by shockingly journalists online. Richard Engel, who's a foreign correspondent for, I believe, NBC. I might be wrong about that, but he basically was suggesting that the US should attack a Russian. I can't remember what it was, a Russian vehicle or Russian troops that were stationed in Ukraine. I can't remember now exactly what it was. Incredibly reckless idea. The thing that I think the most important thing that we can do right now, that the war's begun, and now that the opportunity to actually prevent it from even starting in the first place was basically not used. Now we just have to get a ceasefire to happen as soon as possible. Obviously, it's going to depend on Ukraine and Russia and Putin and Zelensky to figure out some acceptable conditions for them to have a ceasefire. But then also the other really important thing is to maybe the most important thing possible in this whole thing is to prevent this whole conflict from escalating into something that would not just be bad for Ukraine, but be bad for Ukraine and the entire rest of the world, that would result in the completely senseless, pointless death of millions of people in Europe, in Russia, and the United States if conflict ends up spiraling out of control and becoming a nuclear conflict, which once nuclear missiles start flying, it can get very dangerous and can end up spiraling into not just a limited nuclear conflict, but something much bigger. So we have to stop that. We have to push back against every reckless proposal that is put forward or stated by people to do that. And I think the other thing I would say in terms of watching just how bad this is and why I and much more prominent and smarter voices out there were calling for some sort of diplomatic solution to this before Putin made the ultimate decision to invade, was it's not good for the West either. I mean, these sanctions that are going to be that are being put on Russia, they're bad for Russia, of course, and they're going to make misery for the ordinary Russian people a lot worse. But along with that, Russia, because of Russia's oil and gas reserves, it is a difficult country to respond to, because any sanctions on it they already are inevitably blowing back against Europe and the United States. And you're seeing inflation rising already. Oil prices are jumping up. We're seeing wheat prices jump up. That's partly because of mostly because of the invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine is a huge supplier of wheat, but nonetheless, all of this is just shows you why it would have been better to come to a negotiating table and actually talk about those demands that Putin was putting forward about, making some sort of line about NATO not expanding into Ukraine and Georgia. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, now Finland is talking about joining NATO. Actually, there was a poll that showed that the Finnish people are majority in support of joining NATO. So, on the one hand, it seems like Putin's actions miscalculated if that was what he was kind of mainly trying to do to prevent this expansion of NATO. But that also means that it puts things in a much more volatile position, because now it's not just Ukraine that's going to be joining, that's potentially going to be joining NATO and increasing kind of Russian anxiety and sort of potentially provoking some sort of response. But now it's Finland. So it's very hard to know where this is going to go from here. It really is.
Yeah, and to me, the biggest focus has to be on getting a ceasefire. We can't have more escalations, and yet it's terribly concerning to look at not just the United States, but all the different European countries that are putting together weapons packages to be sent into Ukraine. And I don't know if you have any specific response to this issue, but we're seeing threats from Russia, or we're seeing evidence from Russia that they're not going to allow those weapons into Ukraine. So what happens? Do those forces that are trying to make those exchanges and deliver those weapons to Ukrainians, do they get attacked by Russian military aircraft? And how does that do? What if that happens on the borders of Ukraine and these other NATO countries, so to speak? Does that bring NATO friendly forces or the NATO response force into the conflict? Because right now it's just Ukraine being armed by NATO countries, but it's the NATO forces themselves have stayed largely out of Ukraine and aren't there on the ground. So I'm concerned. If you don't mind, I'd like to go ahead. I'll give you a chance if there's anything you wanted to say. Then I have a clip.
Yeah, I mean, I think the entry of any foreign nationals, particularly from a NATO state, into Ukraine to fight or deliver weapons is just inherently dangerous, because if anyone is attacked or killed, captured, whatever, then you start to see there will be calls for some sort of response, because you can't just let a national be killed by a foreign power. And that's when you start to get into, really worrying scenarios of this kind of spiraling into something much worse. I put out actually this piece just before we started talking about some ideas for responding to this, because it has to be responded to. Putin's invasion is illegal. We can talk about there are legitimate security concerns that not just him but Russian elites over the course of decades have been talking to the West about in regards to NATO expansion. But war is not an legitimate or appropriate way to solve those concerns. That is not how a civilized society works or solves its problems. And I mean, we're already seeing every day in real time how much more dangerous this can get, this disastrous decision. So it has to be responded to in some way. The problem is that there are limits in how to respond, because Russia is a nuclear superpower, and the worst thing here would be to turn a regional conflict, as awful as it is, into a nuclear global nuclear catastrophe. So some of the ideas are put forward. Obviously, this is a more medium to long term, but this really shows the need to transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, if not for because you're not worried about the planetary collapse that climate change would bring. And I don't know why you would not be worried about that. But if you're not worried about that, then at the very least, think of the geopolitical implications here of Europe and the United States and the rest of the world's dependence on fossil fuels to run their economies, to run their societies. It means someone like Putin, or someone like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, or any other tyrant who is sitting on a wealth of oil and gas, has relative freedom to act in all manner of illegitimate and outrageous ways, because they know that there's limits to what you can actually respond to them with. So we need to do that. I think we need to really seriously look at cracking down on tax havens. This is something we should have been doing anyway decades ago, but now we have, I think there's a real potential global opinion that would back that. And one of the other ideas I put forward is it's okay, weapons, fine. I don't know how much weapons are really going to change the military balance in this conflict. That's for a military strategist to say. My sense is it's not going to do all that much. At the same time, if we really want to help Ukrainians, most Ukrainians are not fighting in this war. Most of them are taking shelter, or they're trying to survive. They're trying to feed themselves and their families. So there's a desperate need for humanitarian assistance. And it's very telling to me, and I think it's very reflective of the priorities of the people in power, that you compare the amount of money that's been spent on military aid. Just in the past year, it's been over $1 billion. Just a few days ago, it's $350 million worth of military aid that Washington approved. Meanwhile, humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, which has been a desperately poor country for a long time, amounts to a little over $400 million over the last 8 years. So that really shows you the imbalance between, weapons and humanitarian aid. And the idea is that we're sending these weapons in there, and God knows whose hands they're going to end up in. And we're doing it because we care about the Ukrainian people. And yet we can't even muster the same amount of money to make sure that people are clothed and fed and have health treatment while they're having this war waged on them. I think your mic.
Sorry, thank you. I put your article up, and it's 4 ways to counter Russian aggression. Was aggression that do not risk nuclear war. A key clarifier there, because there are ways that we are choosing to help the Ukrainians that are, inviting and potentially provocative to Putin. And I am actually glad that there are Ukrainians in this delegation and Russians in this delegation that met on the Belarusian border earlier, that have started some negotiations going. It's good that people are talking and moving toward a ceasefire. I wanted to play this before we get to the Dissent, which is really why I had you. But I feel like this effort towards ceasefire is only getting poo-pooed on CNN, MSNBC, and they're more interested in the courage and the defiance of Ukrainians, which is all well and good, but we really should be trying to figure out what it's going to take to resolve this and unwind it. There's been quite a lot of escalation, and I think there's been escalation on both sides, though I'm not saying that Russia didn't start it, but at this point, there's been so many layers of sanctions added to Russia. There's been a lot of repercussions that have been heaped upon the country. They're essentially trying to destroy the Russian economy, it looks like right now. And at a certain point, you got to start to unwind this thing backwards so that you can get things to a sustainable level again. And so I have this, I'm going to play this clip. This is what Ned Price said. He was asked about the talks and whether the State Department's supportive. So I'll play this and then I'll let you respond, Branko.
After the talks today between the Ukrainians and the Russians, they announced that they'd have another round in a few days. Just do you have a response to that? And do you think that the continuation of talks is any reflection of how Russia feels about its military advances in Ukraine?
Well, as I said before, we support Ukraine in its efforts to find a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. Ukraine sought before the onset of this invasion to do just that. The United States sought before the onset of this invasion to do just that. Our allies in Europe sought before this invasion to do just that. The OSCE sought to do just that. The NATO-Russia Council sought to do just that. At every turn, the Russian Federation rejected those offers of substantive, constructive engagement. Now that the invasion, we are in the midst of an invasion, we have heard this very message from President Zelensky, from Foreign Minister Kuleba. You would be right to color us skeptical of what it is that Moscow intends. What we've said before, including last week, applies equally today. Diplomacy at the barrel of a gun, diplomacy at the turret of a tank, that is not real diplomacy. We are ready and willing, just as our Ukrainian partners are, just as our European allies are, to engage in real, in substantive, in genuine diplomacy in order to see if we can find a way out of what is a needless, brutal conflict. But that diplomacy is highly unlikely to bear fruit, to prove effective, in the midst of not only confrontation, but escalation. Well before the invasion started, we made the point that we were all for diplomacy, but in order for it to bear fruit, it needed to take place in the context of de-escalation. That is, in some ways, even more true now.
So go ahead, but I don't really think that ceasefires have ever been discussed during periods of non-confrontation or non-escalation. So I don't actually know what Ned's talking about, because ceasefires are always negotiated during wars.
Yeah, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. If you're in the middle of a war and you just want to stop the war, you have to negotiate a ceasefire. By definition, you will be doing so in a war. I mean, it's circular logic. Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing, again, yes, obviously, diplomacy at the barrel of a gun, as he says, is not ideal. But again, none of this is ideal. A war is not ideal. An illegal invasion by Russia isn't ideal. None of this is what any sane person wanted. We have to work within the reality that we find ourselves in. And again, as we've kind of, both of us have stressed today, the most important thing here is to stop fighting, to stop the fighting, so that more Ukrainians aren't being killed, and to tamp down the risks of some sort of wider escalation. In terms of the rest of his statement, I mean, this is the thing. This is the point where when I explain this history, somebody's going to take this out of context and say, you see, this is an apology for Putin. So I want to make clear one more time, make abundantly clear, just because you might have a legitimate security concern does not mean that justifies a war or atrocity against people. And I would liken it to the same thing that we said umpteen times during the war on terror. Obviously, there was a reason why there was certain policies by the West that were done in the Middle East that aroused the anger of some of these extremists that ended up attacking Americans and other countries in the West. We can understand how those Western policies played a part in that without saying, and so that means it was fine for Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda
You weren't a supporter of Saddam Hussein, I would guess, and yet you were totally justified in being opposed to the Iraq War, as was I and anybody else who wanted to say that that country didn't deserve to be destroyed.
Yeah, exactly. And so now that I've done those caveats, let's be clear. Washington did not try to stop this from happening. I think Putin, I don't know whether he was playing this from the beginning, whether it was he decided that they didn't want to back down, he had to follow through on his threat, or what. I really don't know. But I think he was at the very least posturing and making clear that he would go in and potentially attack Ukraine, whatever form that attack would take, if the West didn't negotiate with him over this long-standing issue of NATO expansion. Now that's repugnant logic, but that was his mindset, right? And knowing this, what did the US do? It basically rejected those demands. It didn't even Putin put forward a list of maximalist demands, some of which were pretty unrealistic. I think that was meant to be a sort of starting bid for negotiations. The response from Washington was basically, we're not going to negotiate over NATO membership for countries. Yeah, at the same time as it was saying this, it was openly saying, well, but also Ukraine is not going to join NATO anytime soon. That's not going to happen. And they were making clear that we're not going to fight over Ukraine. We're not going to have a war over Ukraine, which is a sensible position. But what that means is it was this completely nonsensical stance they were taking, which basically just left Ukraine sort of hanging in the wind. And Ukraine is not, completely blameless here either. Not Ukraine the country, but Zelensky the president. I mean, he was saying things. He was shortly before the war started, he went to NATO and he was calling them to defend him. He was talking about maybe getting a nuclear weapon. He continued and his government continued to reject the Minsk Accords, which most international observers and analysts have been saying for a long time is really the only sensible solution to the entire conflict over Ukraine that's been brewing since 2014. Putin obviously holds all the responsibility for choosing this monstrous and idiotic and disastrous decision. But now there's this attempt to use that to say, well, that means, every single thing that the US and the Ukrainian leadership did in advance of this is completely fine and intelligent. And I think we're seeing the outcomes of what happens when you don't try and find a diplomatic solution and you sort of, just dare someone as ruthless and dangerous as Putin is to sort of make good on his threats. And it's not good. It's not good for anyone.
Yeah, and I'll mention the war within the war that seems to be taking place, because we don't get images from the areas of the breakaway republics, Donetsk and Luhansk. We're seeing Kiev, we're seeing some of these other urban cities within Ukraine, and meanwhile, it seems like the Ukrainian military forces have escalated their shelling of the areas that broke away from Ukraine, or these Russian-speaking Ukrainians that have asserted their independence. And again, I'm not saying one faction is more right than the other. I'm not actually taking sides at all, but it's very clear that we're getting an incomplete view of what's going on the ground. We're both led to believe that Ukrainian forces are defenseless and are going to get mowed down by the Russians, while at the same time people are cheering that the Russian forces have not been able to advance due to some of the warfare that has been engaged in on the part of Ukrainian military forces. So, I don't know that they're as defenseless as we would think, because actually even their champions would say that they actually do have artillery in order to defend their cities. That being said, they are definitely under siege, and that is a terrible predicament in which they find themselves. So let's get on to what this crisis has done. It's done what we expect in all wars. Oh, by the way, let me just throw out very quickly. I'd really like to see at some point the diplomatic cables that are going back and forth between these parties during this conflict. And I think like that now, ever since seeing the entire cache of cables from WikiLeaks that Chelsea Manning provided. But it seems that they are consulting with Ukraine. Ukraine has been empowered to have a delegation to negotiate with Russia, but they haven't really empowered the Ukrainians to accept or to concede anything to Russia. I'm not sure what they've given them to offer Russia or to bargain with. And I'm talking about like neutrality when it comes to NATO, maybe removing some sanctions that have been leveled on the Russians in order to convince them to withdraw forces or to pull back forces. Again, like, it's crazy that I'm going to invoke this person because he's done so much destruction to the Middle East, and he's been behind the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. But David Petraeus is actually speaking reason, saying that with Putin threatening nukes, we got to make sure we leave Putin a way out. We have to make sure we leave an exit strategy or a way for them to extract themselves from this, or else we are absolutely going to see horrific examples of war play out on our screens.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, right now that attitude, which I think is a sensible one, is being strongly discouraged because of the style of discourse that has emanated. Which I did not think that in my lifetime, or at least so soon in my lifetime, that I would see the repetition of that dangerous and foolish style of discourse that emerged in the wake of September 11, where basically any attempt to critique or to suggest what other types of Western policies could have been done, not just in the immediate past, but in the last few decades, is cast as betrayal or disloyalty, dangerous, siding with the terrorists, yada yada yada, all the stuff that we're familiar with, and we're seeing a return to that now. And so I think, Petraeus is right. I mean, look, I don't know what's going on in Putin's mind, but we have to operate, I think, from the assumption that he's not as dangerous and ruthless as he is, that he's not a complete madman, and the position he's in may well be one that he's found himself in because of the fact that he's paying himself in a corner by constantly upping the ante. And so it's not doing a favor to him to give him some, as you say, some sort of off-ramp, to give him a way out of this position he's put himself in, which, again, remember, the key thing here is not Putin, but securing and establishing peace and stability in Europe and the rest of the world.
Preventing nuclear war. We have to prevent a nuclear disaster. All right. So while this unfolds, I'm going to go through 3 examples fairly quickly, or as long as you want to spend on each of them, and then we'll conclude the broadcast. But we're having a conversation, a reasonable conversation, and at no point did either one of us call the other a Putin apologist. And that's because we are reasonable people who can talk about complex foreign policy issues and who want to engage in a historical discussion. But we saw the first example I'll start with is the Democratic Socialists of America, which I know that the Jacobins affiliated. Correct if I'm wrong. Stop me. But that's Jacobin's a publication of DSA. And so there were 2 statements that have been put out. And I'll actually read. I'm going to read the one that they put out for February 26th, which is the one that people should focus on, not the one that they put out before they knew that there would be an invasion from Russia, because DSA has been getting attacked for the statement that they put out before an invasion ever happened. But I'm just going to go ahead and read this one from DSA. The Democratic Socialists of America condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and demands immediate diplomacy and de-escalation to resolve this crisis. We stand in solidarity with the working classes of Ukraine and Russia, who will undoubtedly bear the brunt of this war, and with anti-war protesters in both countries and around the world who are calling for a diplomatic resolution. This extreme and asymmetrical escalation is an illegal act under the United Nations Charter and severely threatens the livelihoods and well-being of working class peoples in Ukraine, Russia, and across the region. We urge an immediate ceasefire and the total withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. There's no solution through war or further intervention. The crisis requires an immediate international anti-war response demanding de-escalation, international cooperation, and opposition to unilateral coercive measures, militarization, and other forms of economic and military brinkmanship that will only exacerbate the human toll of this conflict. DSA reaffirms our call for the U.S. to withdraw from NATO and to end the imperialist expansionism that set the stage for this conflict. We call on anti-war activists in the U.S. and across the world to oppose violent escalations, demand a lasting diplomatic solution, and stress the crucial need to accept any and all refugees resulting from this crisis. Much of the next 10 years are coming into view through this attack. While the failures of neoliberal order are clear to everyone, the ruling class is trying to build a new world through a dystopic transition grounded in militarism, imperialism, and war. Socialists have a duty to build an alternative. And then you have the slogan, no war, but class war, at the bottom of the statement. And so let's put up on the screen here what happened in regards to DSA's outspokenness. This is a significant individual. This is Mike Gwynn, who is the Rapid Response Director of the White House, who is seeing that Michael Powell at the New York Times, or is he still at the New York Times? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I thought it was, but I might be wrong.
Well, okay, he's still got it in his name, so I'll say he's affiliated with the New York Times. If he's not, he at least used to work for the New York Times. And he flagged this. He quoted it. He's actually not attacking it. He quoted it. So I'm not going to say that he was the one doing the attack. Mike Gwynn, though, in his position, this is actually his account. This is his White House account. He has a personal account, and then this is his White House account. He used the White House account to attack DSA. And then in this next slide that I'll show, he actually went even farther, and he says, you might want to reevaluate why you referred to the deaths of dozens of Ukrainians seeking democracy and basic freedoms in 2014 as a coup. So if you decide you want to engage that point, you can. But generally speaking, well, first, he's referring to a statement put out in January, which is not the entire position of DSA. They wouldn't have condemned Russia as roundly back in January because there had not been an invasion yet. But then two, he's going after them very clearly. They do not want left-wing opposition to NATO during this conflict.
Well, and this is a no-brainer for someone like Gwynn. And you just have to look at what's happening with the Labour Party over in the UK, where look, Biden's approval ratings are, I think, the lowest they've ever been. I think partly that might explain why the administration didn't really want to negotiate with Putin in advance of this, because of course it would have been painted as weak and the like. And so, now that this is turning into a disaster, a steadily spiraling disaster, the kind of centrist liberal parties do what they often do. What a lot of kind of politicians do when they are feeling the heat is they go and attack the left to prove their sort of bona fides, to prove that they are tough and that they can, they're just as willing to go to war as the people on the right are. And in the Labour Party or in the UK Labour Party over there, Keir Starmer, who hasn't exactly been a tremendously good leader of the Labour Party. That's sort of been his reflexive position, is that whenever things are not going that well, whenever, if he's flubbing interviews or not really able to put Labour ahead of the Tories in the polling, he ends up sort of just ratcheting up this war on the party's left. And at the moment, he attacked the Stop the War coalition in the UK on similar grounds. Basically saying that they were repeating the language and rhetoric of the UK's enemies. He's now gone after Young Labour. He's cancelled their conference and cut their funds because of a statement they put out being critical of NATO. He's not the only one. It's not just Biden and Starmer. Now there's all sorts of people who have said anything that slightly deviates from the kind of standard Washington consensus line is also similarly being attacked. But I just want to make clear, if your idea, if you honestly believe that this line, that the policies of NATO, the enlargement of NATO, that Western policies towards Russia over the past 30 years, long before even Putin had come to power, to bring that up in the context of this current war, and to mention it as illegitimate or as somehow repeating Russian propaganda, or so on and so forth, all this stuff. If you really believe that, then what that means is you have to believe a vast swath of people in the US political discourse are disloyal Putinists. Not just the people in the 90s who were speaking out against the idea of enlargement, including Henry Kissinger, and Biden's current CIA director, who we know at the time said this is a terrible idea. It's basically across the board Russian elite opposition to this policy of NATO expansion. We shouldn't do this. But not just them. At the moment, in the lead up to this particular to this invasion, and now a whole heap of different voices have made the same point, who are not radical leftists or anything of the sort. For instance, Andrew Bacevich, who he's a veteran, he's a conservative Catholic. He was a teacher at West Point. He wrote a piece for the Boston Globe recently, making this exact point, that obviously, as anyone can see with their bare eyes, Putin deserves all the blame and responsibility for what he's decided to do, but also that there are U.S. policies that have been taken over the course of decades and in the lead up to this that also made this scenario possible. And it's not just Bacevich. There are veterans. I had a list of this compiled. I've forgotten some of the names, but Jack Matlock, for instance, he was the former ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was actually there when the Soviet Union dissolved and when there were all these negotiations going on over what exactly NATO's future would be. He was saying this exact same thing in the lead up to the invasion, saying that the US needs to negotiate on this because Russia's made it clear for a long time this is a red line, and this is a way that we could stop war from happening. There is another veteran, and I've forgotten his name now, very annoying, but he was on Rising recently, talking to Ryan Grimm. He was a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He was explaining how, in his view, NATO's expansion has played into this. This is just a small sample of people. But I'm trying to say is that
I think it was Daniel Davis.
Thank you.
Who is actually an Afghanistan war whistleblower who put out some of the papers. Right. He was involved in. Well, actually, he's not the papers guy, but he did come out and blow the whistle on what was going on in Afghanistan, and then it very quickly got brushed aside. Anyways, he's got a lot of credibility, is my point.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and so look, if you want to disagree with that interpretation, that's absolutely legitimate, and if anything, should be encouraged. We need to have debate about every issue. This is part of what a democracy is about. But to just wave that away, not by arguing with it on the merits, but by casting it as some sort of illegitimate point that is sort of apologizing for Putin or justifying this war crime or whatever overheated superlative you want to use. that is out of bounds and really dangerous. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we were hearing from George W. Bush and all the cronies in the Bush administration who organized that illegal invasion of Iraq, which, basically don't question anything, just repeat the lines that we tell you are okay to say. Anything else is not okay. We should not be returning to that very dangerous moment that we had, 20 years ago at this point.
So just before we move on, I just noted this because it's a congressional candidate and because of the language. Max Rose is saying, I am deeply concerned with DSA's statement calling on the U.S. to unilaterally leave NATO in the midst of a level of Russian aggression on the European continent that we have not seen since World War II. I'll just note, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but I have recognized, and so have others, that the history of what happened with Serbia and Kosovo and NATO has been entirely erased from any conversations that are being had about what's taking place in Europe and with Russia right now. And so it's quite skewed, the conversation. But go ahead if you want to say anything.
Well, just there are many things that are forgotten in this moment. So many things, including, the problem is, so the Russian propaganda, the Russian state propaganda that's meant to justify this invasion is, well, Ukraine is governed by Nazis and we're going in to denazify Ukraine, and there's been a genocide against Russian speakers. Both of those are to call them hyperbole is kind of understating it. I mean, it's such an exaggeration. It's ridiculous. And of course, they're using that to basically say, oh, we had to wage this war, because every belligerent country says we're waging a war for defense. But what's happening now is that in reaction to that, we're now getting a completely polar opposite stream of propaganda that basically does the exact same Putin's doing, but from the other side, where the rhetoric is, the Nazi problem in Ukraine is no big deal. Look, there's a Jewish president, so therefore, this is complete hogwash. There's no Nazis that have had influential positions of power in Ukraine, which is just not true. Or you get the idea. People say, well, the genocide against Russian speakers, that's not happening. It's ridiculous. He's just making all this up. He is making it up, but it's also true that the post-Maidan Ukrainian government did pass laws because of the influence of the far right, not necessarily in the government, but because of the street militancy and every other presence that they had to push politics further from the center into the nationalist direction that they wanted. There were laws passed that were, forbidding the Russian language being used, for instance. And a lot of people in Ukraine speak in Russian. So there were discriminatory things that were passed. It's not what Putin was saying, but we shouldn't now do this other thing where we just kind of, it reminds me very much of the war-style propaganda, where basically it's, there's no nuance allowed. It's only one or the other. It's just a stark black and white view. We really got to push against that.
So this is my other example, and then we have one that involves you before we conclude. But the Daily Beast came out against the Gravel Institute in a particularly nasty manner over the weekend. They say they got deleted tweets that reveal a progressive group's Ukraine meltdown. And then I've actually got the bits of the article in front of me. The most important thing is that they call attention to how on February 18th, the group published a YouTube video, they say, that was titled "How America Funded Ukraine's Neo-Nazis." So this is getting to the point you were talking about. And it was renamed after criticism, "America, Russia, and Ukraine's Far-Right Problem." The video reiterated several of the Kremlin's favorite narratives. I'm reading the Daily Beast, by the way. These are not my opinions. Namely, that Ukrainian nationalism is a Nazi-linked phenomenon born in the 1940s and that it has taken root in Kiev and the rest of the country in opposition to its pro-Russian East. Quote, Ukrainian nationalism formed in opposition to the Soviet Union tended to have a strong right-wing flavor, the video asserts. In Western Ukraine, there was more stress on a specifically Ukrainian identity closer to Europe. In Eastern Ukraine, meanwhile, people were more likely to stress their historic ties to Russia and the Russian language. And then again, I'm not actually going to even bring in the gripes that they have. I'm just focused on the stuff that they pulled out here and what necessitated this attack in their view. The video focuses on the supposed power of far-right parties, Svoboda and Right Sector, both objects of obsession in Russian state media, and which respectively hold 1 and 0 seats in the Ukrainian parliament, a fact the Institute's documentary omitted, while emphasizing the influence these parties held in the past and arguing the country's neo-Nazis had become, quote, increasingly powerful, end quote. The documentary made no mention of the fact that current Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish and a native Russian speaker. So what you were getting through. But if you look at I put it back on the screen. I mean, I want to note what we're seeing here in this. First, they call them Moscow mules. And also, it says the Gravel Institute was supposed to be an antidote to right-wing propaganda. Instead, it spread misleading claims aligned with Kremlin narratives. So again, we're doing that thing where the views that are expressed, because they can be seen as similar to the anti-West rhetoric of Putin, then it gets conflated as coming from the same point of view.
I mean, this is one of the most just childish ways to deal with, to argue politics. You just go, oh, well, this person says the same thing as this person, so therefore that means it's bad. I mean, and this was the entire problem with the Trump presidency, is that Trump was horrible and wrong on about 95% of things, and then there were 5% of things that he was correct about, such as the need to withdraw from Afghanistan, such as favoring diplomacy with North Korea. Maybe a few other things that aren't coming to mind right now.
He had severe reservations about NATO.
Right. Yeah. And so, is the idea that suddenly those are bad things. I mean, this is what happened. I remember watching MSNBC and watching Rachel Maddow do a segment on Trump calling for a withdrawal from Afghanistan and attacking him basically from the right. And I was shocked because I remembered watching a segment that she did back in the Obama era, where she was attacking Republicans and the like, who were arguing using the exact same reasoning and talking points that she was now using against Trump, arguing against Obama and withdrawing from Iraq. And so this is such a facile and silly way to discuss politics and to actually work out issues by trying to find which issues align with which bad person and then saying, well, you can't use this because it's bad. I hate to tell you this, but by that logic, there's a whole bunch of things you can rule out because some of the world's worst people happen to have said or supported or whatever those things. And also at the same time, I mean, are we now supposed to dismiss all manner of things just because that happens to align with, say, US or UK government talking points? No, of course, you don't just sort of dismiss something on its face just because of the source it comes from. I mean, come on, are we children here?
Yeah. So one more thing, and then I'll make sure you can go because I've taken up a lot of your time. So this was you that, if I get this correctly, this guy Neil Jones is or was some kind of a leader in the Labour Party in New Zealand. Is that correct?
Yeah, he's a Labour Party guy. Yeah.
And so much like the way there's Labour figures attacking anti-war folks in Britain, you have that going on in New Zealand today, and saying that basically what you wrote was Russian propaganda, like what you'd find in Russia Today, and yet, but weird, he's like, it's still not the worst thing they've published in recent weeks. So you wrote something, he singled it out, but he knows of something from this democracy project that is worse. So I don't know why he's coming after you unless he particularly wants to, because you're with Jacobin or some other deal. But in any case, you wrote something, you thought that there were issues with the crisis that, because you're from New Zealand, that Kiwis should know, and he objected. Very juvenile alley.
I didn't think much of that criticism. I've said kind of what I want to say about it, but I will just say that what that piece was saying was it was saying what should New Zealand do about what's happening in Ukraine, or it's this crisis that was happening in Ukraine. That was published, I think, on February 11th. So that was when it was not clear that an invasion was actually imminent in terms of it was going to happen any day or any hour. That was a time when basically a bunch of European countries and the Ukrainian leadership itself was saying, hold on. We don't have any intelligence that this is going to happen anytime soon. It could happen, but we don't have intelligence it's going to happen right now. So what I was trying to tell people is, first of all, this is some of the history, some of the more complicated and messy history of Ukraine that you probably don't know, because right now there's a lot of talk about how this is a struggle over democracy and all these other things, which is a very simplistic way to look at what was going on. But my fundamental point about what New Zealand needed to do was to continue raising concerns with Russia about its threatening behavior, right? Amassing troops on the border of Ukraine. So continue raising that. However, to also put whatever pressure it could on the US to actually come to the table so that a war didn't have to happen, so that we could avoid all of this insanity that we are now living through. Because ultimately the people who would suffer is not anyone in New Zealand who's thousands of miles away from that conflict and its consequences, but the people of Ukraine, who a lot of people are very keen to call for all manner of military escalation for and take all manner of maximalist stances on, knowing that Ukraine is sadly the one that's going to bear the brunt of that. I don't know how that's possibly controversial. Let's prevent a war from happening while also, telling Russia to not invade. But this is the kind of atmosphere that's building right now. It's a very, very dangerous atmosphere. And unfortunately, there's a lot of cynical people in every country who want to use this terrible thing as an avenue to score points on people that they don't like or people that they politically disagree with, which we're seeing with some of those Max Rose tweets and Conor Lamb and all the other people.
Yeah, and this was evident. We saw this dynamic when the investigation into Trump-Russia allegations took place. But this is much more severe. I mean, war is going to be much more intense for people seeking to speak their mind. And war is always a time when people are called seditious or traitorous because they critique their own government's foreign policy. And so thank you for coming to be part of this space. I'm going to try to do this regularly so that I can have voices on that are not just simply repeating what the State Department's memo of the day is saying on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because we need to have this broad kind of a nuanced conversation that doesn't just look through a soda straw and consider what took place in February, but considers everything going back to 2014, even going back before that, recalls some of the prudent moves that Barack Obama took to not escalate the conflict, not provoke Russia, even goes back to the 1990s when you had a revered figure like George Kennan, who was opposed to the expansion of NATO and wrote that, as I've mentioned multiple times now on this channel, in the New York Times, that it would be a fateful error to do exactly what NATO proceeded to do over the last 25 years. And so I'll let you give any final thoughts, or we could just, we can just conclude with you, but maybe it might be worth it just to ask you, how are you staying informed about what happens? Is there anything in particular you're following? Anybody? I mean, I'm not a source of information. I'm just commentators, and you're a commentator as well. So have you found some place that helps you feel like you know what's going on in the conflict, or is that another concern of yours that hey, I don't really know if I am certain of what's going on, and that's going to affect my ability to engage with this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the beginning, I think we could analyze things and we could say what was more likely than other things, but I don't think anyone's ever been really confident about exactly what was going to happen. And I think it's now even more unclear. I mean, I really have no idea what exactly the Russian military status is in regards to the invasion. There's people saying that actually, Russia's not doing very well. Other people are saying the opposite. I really don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. Maybe there's someone out there, but I think for the most part, it's a lot of noise. I'm trying to stay away from the cable news stuff. That stuff is completely uninformative, and it's really just propaganda. I try and read Russian sources. Medusa is an English and Russian web outlet that does a lot of good stuff. They're very critical of Putin. They're by no means Putinist aligned. They're useful. I really love antiwar.com. They're a libertarian website that I think that they have a tremendous reserve of very well-informed commentators that actually gives you an idea of what's going on beyond just wishful thinking of various sides, whether Russian or American. And I think just generally, I think just try and read everything possible. And try and read reporting from people who are particularly non-Western journalists who are over there and sort of have been working this stuff for a long time. If you want to get a real sense of like what exactly is going on and what the feeling is.
All right, thank you, Branko. Well, I'll let you go. I'm going to say a few things to some of my viewers and wrap this up. But good luck, and everyone, you should really follow Branko. He's got some good commentary on this. What's your handle again? Go ahead and throw it out.
It's BMARCHETICH, which is a kind of transliteration of how you meant to pronounce my name.
It's a good guide, and also you're on your writing is on Jacobin, and you've been putting together some good analysis of this, and also some ideas on how to go forward that are constructive. So,
well, thank you for doing this as well.
I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Yeah. All right.
And then let me get to a few of your questions before I sign off, just because there are a few issues that are worth tackling here. Just to go through what some of you have been saying throughout this broadcast. So I'm going to scroll up here, tackle as the one-man band that I am, some of what you've had to say. I have a question here from Dan about the European Union's history parallel with NATO expansion. We're seeing that EU is moving and expediting the process of adding Ukraine into the European Union. To Putin, that's definitely a provocative move to be making. It's happening while tanks and other Russian forces are bearing down upon cities in Ukraine, capable of shelling them intensely. And I don't know if that's the right move that you should be making while civilians are encircled by one of the three greatest military powers in the world, but certainly the EU, in the way that it moves to expand, establish those agreements. I know this goes back all the way to what was happening in 2013 and 2014 when they were trying to bring in the Ukraine in order to be part of the European Union. It was going to require a plan. I think there was a package of austerity measures that were attached of sort of neoliberal development measures that they would have to incorporate into their country in order to be welcomed into the EU. Certain trade agreements that they'd have to establish. There are goals that are discussed in the cables published by WikiLeaks that show how they got to that point, although the cables stopped at 2010, but they've been moving in that direction. So I'd say the concerns about NATO are not maybe exactly with EU, but this is an issue because one of his justifications for this offensive is that he still wants the sphere of influence, and he's got Belarus, he's got Crimea, and he wants to have all of Ukraine if he's not going to be able to get neutrality to be accepted by NATO. And neutrality at this moment seems like it's off the table if you listen to the world leaders from Europe and US. I do not believe that Zelensky's or the Ukrainian delegation has been empowered to accept neutrality. And I don't think they would, because right now they feel very strong having the support of the globe. It's what it feels like. They've at least got all of the Western world rooting them on. And so why not become part of them. They don't want to be part of Russia's sphere of influence. They want to be part of the West. And how that may imperil Ukraine. Ian, you said I don't see either side backing down. So the question is, which side has gamed this out better and how far out of control things will spiral? And Dan had another question about corporate news. Is there a way to decrease sales viewpoint? Consumers now only support sponsors, products, and services. There's a comment from Roger. Can expect that Ned Price would take issue with getting an incomplete view of issues. He would likely respond that they are giving us a completely incomplete view of issues. Ian again says it seems no, it's been deliberate for years. They will never drop the sanctions or give Russia security guarantees. So what incentive for Russia to stop, especially if it is all inevitable? That's my concern as I see all the sanctions that are layered upon each other. And we're seeing people who are athletes be told that they can't compete in their sports. We're seeing entertainers, artists being shut out of venues, being shut out of opportunities, airspace entirely closed over these countries to Russian aircraft. The amount of ostracization, demonization of the Russian people, while at the same time sanctions are imposed that entirely cripple the Russian economy, driving the ruble down, doing this damage, which is going to impoverish millions upon millions of Russians, and saying that you're going to do this because it's going to put pressure on the Russian government and particularly President Vladimir Putin. While he's worth over $100 million, he has the ability to go into bunker mode and not really respond to what is going on with his people. And, you know, he's been in power for quite a long time. He could choose to just not seek re-election and then ride this out and make these choices, expecting that some other successor was come along. And I think I go back to what Ian just said. How has this been gamed out? We don't really know what Russia's plan of attack here is going forward. And it's also not really clear what the West's plan is, too. They just keep heaping on sanction after sanction. They just keep doing this, signing off on more and more weapons packages, encouraging people to go there and fight along Ukrainians, people who are not experienced fighters. And they are fueling this. They are putting gasoline on the fire. And I don't know that either side really has any bearings when it comes to how do we undo this and walk this backward. It almost seems like they are prepared for the new normal to be that Russia is entangled in Ukraine and that Ukraine is this war zone for a Russia, and that they want a quagmire for Russia to be fighting. And I've seen some documents, some discussions by think tanks about how you could cripple Russia, and in effect that makes it easy to focus on China as a rival power. And if you can knock Russia down and not have a multipolar world where, you know, Russia is even powerful enough to align with China, then it means that the United States can still be this power that matches up with the power of China. U.S. having more of the military dominance, China working on expanding the economic influence and not so much having the military dominance. And we can focus, or the U.S. government can focus on countering China. And with Russia decimated, then they don't really have to contend with Russia. Although I would say that they haven't really had to contend with Russia for many years, because they haven't been what the Soviet Union was as a power that rivaled the United States for a couple decades, having collapsed. So the DSA statement was pretty reasonable. It's a principled anti-imperialist position that is taken. And then is a few other comments. You're pointing to Yemen, Dan. Yeah, Yemen. What we've seen on full display is that the people who are talking about this conflict are doing so in a manner that focuses on the identity of Ukrainians as being white and ignoring these conflicts that have been unfolding with Black and brown bodies. We are not seeing the kind of coverage of Yemen that we've seen in the past days that have made this a crisis. There is no efforts to shut off Saudi Arabia from the world in the same manner that is being done towards Russia. We also have a conflict playing out in Ethiopia, and they're talking about a ceasefire, but that's a conflict between African people, and it's apparently a normal. So people are not scrambling to try and help them bring about peace in Ethiopia. So it's acceptable. And we've had other places that have had massive, massive losses of life. I see Dan mentioning Congo, conflict in Syria, and there's nothing done. No, you don't have wall-to-wall coverage. So go to the end here. If U.S. government cuts off electricity to Russian embassies, then you know the shit has hit the fan. Well, yeah. We are seeing measures taken that put us on a path of increasingly of no return, and that is troubling. And we're hearing people talk about things like, well, we're only 5 days into this war, so it's like it's not even been that long yet. But 5 days is quite a long time when you're talking about people in Ukraine who have had tanks roll up on their cities and have faced the threat of bombs being dropped at any hour of the night or any hour of the day. And it's very indifferent, very view from 50,000 feet to say that we can just accept the presence of Russian forces in Ukraine, and we can arm Ukrainians, and we can find a way for them to fight back in this crisis. And that's the way to handle the escalation from Russia. De-escalation is the answer. There needs to be work towards a ceasefire, and it is the only answer. And it is the answer that I'll continue to fight for. And advocate for and discuss through the platforms that I have available, by speaking with you all. Thank you for tuning into this broadcast. Thank you for listening to Branko. Let me put up a few things here. And this is the newsletter, The Dissenter, that I curate. I've been doing a little bit of writing on the war, but I won't be doing a lot. It's supposed to be a newsletter about whistleblowers. It's a newsletter where I cover the case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, which I may add at this hour. There's somebody who is a political prisoner in Belmarsh who is hugely impacted by the war happening in Ukraine. And Julian Assange came out in solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and then saw that there were individuals who we don't have to get into, who were attacking him and doubting his solidarity with Ukraine and blaming him once again unfairly, slanderously, for being a Russian asset who helped Donald Trump get elected. And without going into all the details, which have been covered repeatedly through my work and on this channel to debunk that, we have to admit that getting the charges dropped against Julian Assange just became 1,000 times harder with this war, knowing the orientation, the zeal of people who are involved in waging this conflict in the US government. If you couldn't get Biden and his White House and the Justice Department to drop these charges and recognize the problem of going after a journalist before, try doing it now. Even though the CIA could not find any proof that he was a Russian asset or that WikiLeaks people were a Russian asset, it doesn't matter, because that's the perception the media created. That's the public mobbing campaign that we've seen and witnessed, which Niels Meltzer documented in his most recent book. And so anyone who's an activist who cares about this case, anyone who's a journalist who cares about what could happen if Julian Assange is put on trial, have to take a step backwards and challenge the Cold War atmosphere that will allow for putting Julian Assange on trial. Give him even more room, because people will say things like, I don't support going after journalists. I'm a defender of the First Amendment, but when you're a Russian asset, ... And at that point, that's all the prosecutors have to hear to feel good and justified as they walk into the Eastern District of Virginia every day, whether that's in 2023, 2024, whenever he's finally brought to the United States, if he can't win in the courts in Ukraine. But now in the UK, you have to be concerned that those judges are thinking similarly about the allegations against Julian of being a Russian asset. So they can't think clearly about the principles that are at issue in the case, because what if he really is a Russian asset? What if he really was out to destroy democracy? Well, we better let him go to the US and let them sort it out. Extradition approved. So we have a lot of work to do in order to challenge perceptions, and I do that with the Dissenter newsletter. And then if you don't want to sign up and you don't want to become a monthly subscriber that way, you can support this kind of work that we're doing with this channel by going here to shadowproof.com/donate and let us know that you're doing this because of the channel, or you can go to Patreon and become a member there and support us with monthly pledges. So I thank you. We need more than ever right now to make sure that we defend this space. We have to have a space to have these conversations. I'm not the only one who's dissenting. I'm not the only person who is doing this. There are others. I have a list. I'm going through them. I'm engaging with those people. Branko mentioned antiwar.com. They're doing dissent from a libertarian political bent. I'm doing this from a left wing or from the left, an anti-imperialist bent that is more rooted in that. And but we want all voices. People who are former military who object to this, realist foreign policy thinkers who object, people like John Mersheimer who object, people like Stephen Walt who have reservations, who are really well aware of how we got here, from the socialists to even people who are Trump supporters who don't like the path that we went down. We need to allow for those people to express these views, because we're all going to benefit if we defend having a wider spectrum of conversation about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to be protecting and defending our own democracy, and not just here in the US, but the ability to have freedom of expression all around the world. That's what I'm doing here. That's why I did this broadcast. That's what's important as journalists, to be able to publish and not face smears and retaliation. As activists, the ability to step forth and assemble. And we want to have the same support that the Russians have in Moscow as they challenge Putin. We want to be able to say things like abolish NATO or to challenge NATO expansionism without being seen as seditious traitors. And so that's why I'm doing this, and I'll expect to be back soon, either on Tuesday or Wednesday, with another guest to talk with you about the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine war and to dig into another set of issues that are crucially important. With that said, I thank everyone for watching, and I'll see you around.